Hello, and welcome to another episode of Tech. Today, we are going to talk about leading with emotional intelligence, the power of EQ in communication. I'm Carolina Milanese, and I'm your host. I said it before, EQ is really an empathy, are the superpower of leaders, whether they're leading a tech company or in another vertical. And I strongly believe that it's true today as it was true during COVID, when we started to talk more about essential skills and really empathy in leadership. And this is true about the US as it is internationally. Trying to connect with your talent internally or your customers and partners is becoming more and more critical, especially when you're trying to reach out and engage with younger generations. Today, I'm joined to have this conversation by Jessica Jensen. Jess has a career that spans considerable amount of time, less so than I, because she's way younger than I am, but has worked for Fortune 500 companies like Nestle, Adidas, Microsoft, and Qualcomm. She is now a founder of Copilot Communications. And over the years, she's really focused on cutting edge approach to communication and digital communication in particular. And in her new role as founder, she's really harnessing that cutting edge approach to digital marketing to empower executives to bring their voice back, to own their narrative, whether it is in real life or in digital format, to bring that EQ and empathy in the conversation. And now, please help me welcome Jess to the conversation.
Yay. Thank you, Carolina. It's so good to be here.
Thank you for finding the time. I am very excited about the conversation because you and I have known each other for quite a bit. And we doing this at a week after something happened in the US, empathy all around. And I do think that now more than ever, especially around topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion, sustainability, and generally the relationship between technology and social, that empathy is going to become more and more important for leaders. But I talked about this ad nauseum, and I really would like you to explain to our audience why the concept of emotional intelligence, I mean, I named the podcast after it, so I do think it's important. But why is it important for leaders?
Yeah, it is such an important topic, and I agree with you, very timely. So, there's a few key tenets of emotional intelligence, and I know that you've covered these. I'll maybe highlight a couple that are my favorite. The notion of being self aware, which I think if you are someone who's self aware, you take for granted that maybe everyone is self aware. But it's not the case. And I think when you have that depth of sort of reflection and thoughtfulness, it leads you naturally to a place of empathy and often humility, because you recognize, you've got work to do just like everyone else. So that's a really important piece. Another one is the notion of being having a steady hand, right? So making decisions that both balance the analytical as well as the qualitative, and not reacting impulsively, sort of taking the time to be thoughtful and consider multiple audiences, and perhaps knock-on effects of a decision that you might make with that steady hand.
I
Um,
smile because I think that too often there's a there's almost like a, especially on social, there's a pressure to say something because maybe your competitors are saying something. And I love what you said, because sometimes actually not saying anything says a lot more than rushing out and saying something that might not be true to your brand or yourself, or not be entirely thought out. So yes,
yeah.
100% agree with you.
Yeah, well said, for sure. Um, I feel like another aspect that's really relevant also to the time that we're in is this notion of being open-minded, and being willing to hear other opinions and perspectives that might initially feel contradictory or sort of not aligned with maybe where you're at. But knowing that, and we see it bear out in the numbers, knowing that that diversity of points of view, whether you're in a boardroom and you're talking about, profitability, you're in a nonprofit organization, what you're in a political atmosphere, we know that better decisions are made when there are lots of different viewpoints that get to weigh in, and are respected.
Yes, could not agree more. And I think there's going to be a lot of this could not agree more going on during our conversation. But it's true, having more point of views, all it does is just makes you more informed, right? And it gives you, if you're talking about empathy, it gives you that extra knowledge to be able to develop empathy, maybe for a segment, a cohort, or a point of view that you didn't necessarily understand or had preview to. So I think that is really, really important. If we push the conversation a little bit further and think about kind of skills, like emotional intelligence skills, that leaders can and should develop to improve how their communication lands and how impactful their words can be, what would those be?
Listening is a big one, and I mean, this is something, boy, I bet I certainly work on. I know a lot of us probably have to work on, especially the pace that we run in many of our jobs. But I've observed that in high emotional intelligence leaders, they're very good at active listening, which I wasn't really sure what that even was for a while. I had to kind of do my own due diligence. And I'll give an example. I had a person on my team at my last company who was really good at this. He was a really good active listener, and I think it was just innate in him. And I told him many times, I complimented him on how I always felt very heard when we had a conversation. He was really good at sort of reflecting back what he heard me say, but not in a artificial way, like in a very natural conversational way. And I think that it takes such confidence to slow down, to actually listen, not because you're waiting for your turn to speak, but because you want to learn something from that other person. And then also really ensure that they feel they were heard, because that furthers that relationship long term.
Yes, yes, and yes. I do think that oftentimes we don't, and that's particularly, in my view, particularly needed when people who don't often get the opportunity to sit at the table are at the table. Making sure that those people feel heard is critical, but not in the way where I repeat your question to make sure I heard you. Is really about listening and building, giving credit to the person that came up with the, because this is something maybe is an analyst trait, I don't know, but there's often the, oh yes, the I repeat what you just said, and this is not to stereotype men, but often is the case. You repeat what somebody else said, but making it sound it was your idea in the first place.
Mhm.
That is not what active listening is, right?
No, not at all. No, I really think it's all about your motivation. It's coming from a place of, I think that I can learn something from you. I mean, I like, part of the reason I love going to parties, honestly, is because I get to meet all these different people, whether it's a friend of a friend or, someone, it's a larger situation where it's, there's neighbors I've never met. I love the idea of just learning people's stories, how do they spend their day, where are they from originally? There's just so much you can learn, I think, from every conversation. And I think if you're a leader that comes at it from that perspective, that you have that kind of growth mindset, as we've all heard, that Carol Dweck term, then you walk away with data, you walk away with information, and ideally, again, the relationship is furthered because that person actually thought what they said mattered.
Yeah, and I think that coupled with that, there's the, you mentioned waiting to, like, not listening to the person, but just waiting for that window of opportunity to say what you want to say without actually thinking and taking in what the other person said. I think that oftentimes, especially in a corporate environment, it feels like you need to justify your presence by speaking, and that's not necessarily true. And I think that people that tend to be either more confident or are used to be at the table don't feel the need to justify their presence there. Um, and I don't know if that's your experience too, but it's certainly been my experience in a male dominated tech world.
Yeah, for sure. And often it is the quiet ones that often are the senior person in the room. They allow everyone else to pipe in and dialogue and debate, and will wait, maybe halfway through a meeting before they really chime in with their perspective, knowing that if they were the first one to speak or the one that speaks the most, everyone else is just going to fall in line and they're going to kind of shut down that diversity of thought. I love that. I love when that person allows the space for others.
Doesn't happen very often, but I think that that's where during COVID um, we had the ability through what you and I are doing now, which is a virtual presence, a digital presence, to accommodate different styles that maybe in-person meeting room was not necessarily possible. And I hope that it stays through going forward, especially as we start to have, AI helping with whether it is language barriers or other um, facilitating roles, if you like, bringing people people together. Let me ask you more of a kind of a personal experience. If you can recall examples on how EQ has positively impacted leadership communication, either for you or some of the leaders that you encounter either at parties or in boardrooms.
Yeah. No, I love this question. And I thought I gave some thought to this because I have had a number of really good managers and leaders over the years. And I've had a couple that weren't so good. And I and I think that, as I'm sure you'll agree, we all learn. Ideally, we're all paying attention and we're learning from both the greats and the not so greats. So I'll just give a quick example of kind of one of sort of each end of that spectrum. Um, Early on in my career, my 20s, I had a manager who was pretty unpredictable, emotionally unpredictable, kind of big mood swings up and down. I think today we'd probably use the term that we lacked emotional safety, but we didn't have that term 15 years ago. But it really kind of felt like for many of us, we were walking on eggshells. We didn't know what to expect each morning when we came into work. And so that kind of erratic and almost like volatile behavior, it naturally closed a lot of us down. As a young person in my career, I didn't learn a tremendous amount because you just sort of wanted to stay out of the way and not not be in the eye of that potential storm. Yeah, that line of fire, yeah. And eventually over the years that, I worked there, it kind of bled into everyone. There was sort of this generally hostile, kind of stressful environment that I think a lot of people really internalized. Um, but I'll compare that to a more recent leader who wasn't my direct boss, but was someone more senior than me, and I became friends with, and he was sort of a mentor. And he was, I mean, he's someone I'll probably always think back on highly throughout my career. He really embodied that servant leadership approach, and something I aspire to be, a servant leader. He was empathic. He was a great listener. He was the guy who in the room would let everyone else go first. and sort of quietly share his thoughts after, and then do a great job of kind of connecting the right people together to, have follow-on conversations. um, he wasn't afraid to give the spotlight away to his team. He didn't have a big ego. He didn't need to be up in front. And it just, the word that comes to mind is like a magnetism. It drew you to him. You wanted to follow him because you felt like he was a steward of the company, number one, which we all, wanted to be. But you also trusted that he would be looking out for your best interests.
That is as a as part of a talent pool, I think that is one of the rarest form of leadership that you encounter. Somebody that can put your interest and the company interest together versus I've had my fair share, like you, of good and bad leaders, and I think it's a bit, having worked both in Europe and the US, is a little bit more like a US style where you had the classic, it's holiday season, spend time with your family. Oh, yeah, but it's Q4 too. So remember your target at the end of the year, right? So it's like, okay, so do I spend time with my family, or do I actually, look at the numbers and hit the Q4 number? So there's a lot of, I'm supposed to be saying this, but I don't actually mean it. And I want you to stay, versus the kind of leadership that you're referring to, about balancing both and say, yes, it is Q4, but it's also necessary that you spend time with your family and you don't burn out and you truly recharge and then come back and hit that number. Um, you started out the conversation talking about self-awareness as
Yeah.
kind of, if you like, the cornerstone of both EQ and empathy. Uh, how can a leader kind of look in and understand, first of all, at what level of emotional intelligence they are, and then identify ways to work on improving? Because it's not easy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, number one, it's like so many things. Any behavioral change we want to make in our lives, right? Whether it's around eating more vegetables or going for more long walks, it's all about, we have to start with the intention, and we have to actually care enough to say, I'm gonna I'm going to be intentional about this. I'm going to give it some time to think. I'm gonna develop a plan. I'm gonna maybe get some accountability partners. But it's a goal, and I'm going to go after it. So I think that's number one, is just frankly caring about being self-aware because you see the benefit in it. And then obviously asking for feedback from your team is like the first thing that comes to mind. Now, there has to be an environment that feels safe to give that feedback, right? And it's a challenge internally, to be honest, because if you're a leader, many of the people that you're asking for feedback from work for you, right? Their paychecks are dependent on their employment. And they ultimately don't want to upset you, right? They don't want to surprise you. Um, so it takes, I think, either having confidants that perhaps are outside of your leadership sort of line, right? Whether it's maybe a customer that you've just grown close with over the years, or maybe it's a peer in another division of the company that you can speak with candidly. Um, but I mean, shameless plug, like, to be honest, this is why there are people in my role. It's to give those, right? Yeah, it's to give a partner to a leader that's coming from the outside, but has corporate internal experience, understands a lot of what they're going through, um, but can do things like audit, how they write, how they speak publicly, how they do things like this when they do interviews. And is it aligned with the values that they actually want to portray as a leader? And is it consistent across how they show up internally and externally? Again, in different mediums, is there consistency there? That kind of analysis is hard to do on your own of yourself. You really do need someone to be a partner.
So double down on your corporate plug, and explain a little bit more, because I think is what you just said is very important. Is about y- your channels and your voice being consistent, right? And it's hard to do that when, first of all, you don't own your voice across. If you're a leader, oftentimes you're a different team that manage your social and the people that manage your, keynote speeches, your press releases, or whatever the case might be, um, and actually help you ground you. So tell me more, your role and what specifically you help with.
hmm Yeah. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, Carolina, and probably many of our listeners that have marketing or business backgrounds are often when you begin a campaign in marketing or communications, you start with a creative brief. And that creative brief is like this blueprint, right? It's got audience definition. It's got single most important message. It's got here's the three things you want them to walk away with. If nothing else, remember these, right? It has competitive environment analysis, timing, all that stuff. In many ways, what I do with my clients is build one of the big pieces is build a creative brief for them, but we call it a narrative platform. So it's first of all, again, just stopping and pausing and asking, what are the values that are most important to you to get across in your communications? Set aside where it's going to show up. Is it audio, written, vision? Doesn't matter. For now, just what are the core tenets? One of the ways that I used to ask that question at Qualcomm with our C-suite is I would say, what do you want to stand for?
Mm.
And for a lot of us, I mean, again, me included, that's a big
I ask that to
question.
my clients every other week, if not more often. Yeah, absolutely. As a person, as a leader, and as a brand, right?
Yep. And obviously, if you're a leader inside of a company, which is who my clients are, then there needs to be a synergy between what the corporate brand represents and what you as a human
Yeah.
represent. Ideally, it's a Venn diagram, right? There's some crossover, and then there's some pieces that may be unique to the company and other pieces that are unique to you. And so maybe where you emphasize in that narrative platform is a little bit more on that center point of the Venn diagram with some sort of sprinkling in of your own personality on the side. But I think that first knowing what you want to stand for and then how you can augment what the corporate marketing machine that's already in play is doing, right? You're augmenting it, not replacing it.
Yeah.
That to me, that's the 1 + 1 = 3.
So let's go back, with everything you just said. Let's go back to EQ and tell me some of the shortcomings and pitfalls that leaders with low EQ might encounter.
Yeah, this is such a good question because again, I had to really think through this and sort of recall past environments that I've worked in and observed. We talked briefly already about the listening piece. So obviously, the opposite there is sort of you're not really listening; you're just waiting to speak. Um, I think another one is sort of oversensitivity to criticism or feedback, maybe even misinterpretation of body language from others. But sort of just not a openness again to have that learning mindset, that growth mindset. Um, Another one that I've seen is being dismissive of others' ideas, and I think a lot of leaders know better publicly. They know they shouldn't do that. They've found ways to massage it. Um, but again, it's like at your core, are you really hearing some of those ideas, even if maybe you don't acknowledge it in the moment? But are you sort of internalizing those? And especially if you hear them by maybe a few different people, a few different times there might be a pattern that's worth observing. So if you're kind of just dismissing things, you've got your agenda, you know the way. That's often not a sign of high EQ. And then
Yeah.
maybe one, oh, sorry, please.
No.
Just one more might be avoidance, which is almost the opposite of some of the more kind of driving an agenda, but avoidance of difficult conversations. And rather than, and this is again hard for a lot of us, but rather than having those more sensitive, challenging conversations with whomever it is that you need to have it, you're choosing to speak about them behind their back when they're not there, share it with others, instead of just addressing it head on to really get to the bottom of it.
And I said at the beginning, and I think you agree, that empathy is a superpower for any executive. And I hope it will stay like that despite the week that we had last week and where we're heading. I'm curious I see empathy as a big part of EQ, but it's not the same thing or limited to. What does empathy towards the audience that I'm addressing allows me to do as a leader?
Yeah. One of the have you seen that animated short by Brene Brown where she compares empathy to sympathy?
Yes, the
Yeah,
difference between the two, because people think is the same thing.
yeah. I mean, and again, I've been guilty of that. I'm sure I've said the wrong things to girlfriends over the years when I should have said the other thing,
Yeah.
trying to silver line it, trying to make it better, rather than just being with them in that moment. And so I think that it can show up in communication in the, if you think about that cartoon, sort of the word that comes to my mind is generosity. When you think about there was the cartoon had animals, right? And there's the one with the ladder and then the two. And so the idea that the one that was showing empathy was sort of down below, right, on ground level with the one that was hurting and was willing to stay there with them and be in that moment and sort of share time, right? Without any ask for anything in return. And I think that if we up level that to sort of how we communicate, Seth Godin famously talked about this years back, right? The idea of being generous with our ideas, our content, our creations, and not expecting to get something in return from it. I think that comes through when we are on podcasts or on social, wherever the digital platform might take us. If we're coming at it from a place of, I actually really hope this helps somebody, and that's it, then it shows.
I hope that that's what comes through in my podcast, because that's exactly what I'm setting up myself to do, to first of all create a platform where somebody like yourself can come and share their wisdom, so that maybe we can help or support or validate somebody. And I think what you were saying about the time and the grace and the generosity part also links back to listening versus speaking, and something that I'm working on personally in my relationship with my child, for instance, where I am oftentimes, because they're feeling a certain way, try and over explain why I did what I did, versus just let them be and let them feel what they feel and let them come to me. And I think that that's true about work relationships and leadership relationship as well, that we don't always have to feel the silence or over explain our position, but let the person that, or the people that we are interacting with, find their way towards what we have said. um, I'm
Yeah.
still working on it.
Yeah. Well, kudos to you for trying. I mean, yeah, all of us parents are working on that. I think that ties back to what you said at the top, though, Carolina, about the person in the room that perhaps is okay being quiet
Mm,
and allowing that silence to speak.
yeah. So if you had practical steps to increase our EQ in that kind of communication settings, You mentioned the three things. There's always three things. What would those three steps be for our audience to walk away with?
Yeah, I have three. Okay. So, number one, so here's a very tactical, practical one, and I'm going to give credit to a good friend of mine named Jen Whelan. So she does this with her team. She's a CMO. So she's got just a live spreadsheet, Google Sheets, whatever you want to use. And she puts in there her open office hours, right? Like thinking back to our college days, university. And she then allows anyone on the team, no matter what level they are, have they their direct reports or not, to pop in and just populate little 20-minute windows in that spreadsheet. And then she meets with them one-on-one, and it's a total open door, whatever they would like to share with her, or if they've got a concern. And she's been doing that for years. And I know she's gotten some of her best ideas, best learnings from those one-on-one conversations for anyone on the team to utilize. So I love that idea.
Yeah.
Two, going back to the idea of empathy, which empathy is rooted in, frankly, in vulnerability. And vulnerability, I feel like, has gotten talked about a lot in the last couple of years. But historically, it really wasn't part of business conversations at all. So I think that
Certainly not in a positive way.
right, yes, totally. So I think that's shifting, which is great as we're seeing more of these servant leaders, as we're seeing a diversity of people that are at that leadership table. We're seeing more openness to sharing your vulnerabilities. And so, one of my favorite things to do is just to share something that you're working on as a leader with your team. Like again, whether it's something that's work related, maybe it's your training for a marathon. And, right now you're running at most two miles at a time. You've got a long way ahead of you. But sharing updates with your team about what you're doing to accomplish a certain goal or curb a certain behavior, I think just humanizes you in such a great way. And then people also, again, they could be, if they're younger, they could be intimidated to even know what to say to you in the elevator. Now they can ask you about how's the training going? So I like that one. And then my third and last one I'm such a believer in this, is the idea of studying the greats. So noticing, and this is a great way you can use social media, but podcasting too. If there are leaders, whether they're in your industry, whether they're your gender, your age, it doesn't matter, but they're people that you really feel like do it the way that you wish you could. Take the time, right? Go deep on those people. I'll give you a quick example. Maybe because I used to work at Microsoft, but I've always been a fan of Bill and Melinda Gates. And of course, the work they do now is, powerful in totally different ways. There's a series right now on Netflix called What's Next, and Bill Gates hosts it. And he covers 5 different topics in these 5 episodes. And to see someone like him, who we all know all the things, right? I mean, his history and his contribution and his prominence, right? But he sits down with, Bernie Sanders and Lady Gaga and James Cameron, these sort of industry captains, right? That are from all walks of life. And he's such a good listener. He's so thoughtful. He really wants to hear what they have to say, and you can tell. And so it sort of engenders this kind of this sort of aspirational quality, like I need to be more. And look at him, if he can be that kind of listener and learn, I need to be better at that too.
Well, I think we all can. We're almost at time, but before I let you go, I want you to bring it back to brand, because you and I share as we are with our personal brands. And so that fan that you were talking about, where there's crossover, there's a lot of crossover, because at the end of the day, people buy into us as human being and buy into the brand that we represent. But for a large organization, that is obviously very different. So how does an EQ-led approach to leadership benefit the brand that I'm working for?
Yeah, I love this question. It actually came up a lot when we first started doing the executive digital communications work at Qualcomm. Um, if someone didn't have just an inherent curiosity about digital platforms, you had to do some convincing and some influencing. And so that why came up a lot when they're as busy as they are. Every 30 minutes matters. So, in my experience, first of all, just from a data standpoint, we know that engagement with individuals is far higher than with brands. We would see it play out. The same announcement could come from, Carolina, you versus the company that you work for, and your post would get 3 times the engagement. So we know data supports this, but you also feel it, right? It's a difference when you read, again, whether it's a social post, a blog, a podcast interview, it from an individual. There's a humanity and a authenticity that you hope comes through, that drives trust with them. But frankly, the halo, right? The halo is it drives trust with the whole company, the whole brand. So I always talk about the idea of executive communications being, again, augmenting. It's in addition and incremental to what a brand or a marketing department can do, and it's a win for both.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I see really a difference, especially for some brands that changed CEO and had a very drastic difference in how much the CEO engages with people in an authentic way. Not, yes, I'm in digital, social, but I have a team that tweets or posts on my behalf, because you can tell, especially if you follow the executive closely and you know what their personality is like. So I think coming through in a genuine way definitely helps showing up for the brand itself. We are at time, but people can reach you where to engage with you and know more, hire you, see, follow you, and read and learn. Where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you. So just go to my website. It's copilotcommunications.com.
Not an easy name to forget, thanks to all the marketing that Microsoft is putting behind that name. But
Maybe
so
slightly on purpose. I don't.
very, very well played. And to be honest with you, very well played in terms of there's a big, as we talk more about AI, that human component has to stay central to what we do, and will, in my opinion, will remain a key differentiator, and for leaders going forward. Thank you. I really appreciate your time and the conversation, and I certainly learned, and will practice more my active listening.
Thank you, Carolina. Good to see you.
Thank you, Jess. Take care.